Hey you guys, here's a really quick endgame lesson for you. So it's a game I've just played against a guy in Canada rated 1307, and he's got the white pieces, I'm playing with the black pieces, and we just incredibly quickly everything got taken off the board and we found ourselves in an ending. It felt like within about a minute. So let me take you through the game so far. So we've got a French defence, exchange, queen checks, blocked, bishop comes out, so he's now got two attackers on the bishop, but I've got two defenders, and I decide to move one of my defenders away. I suppose the king is also a defender, so what this means is that after these exchanges, my king is now moved, so is unable to castle. And I decide to exchange this bishop, because after this pawn pushes forwards, when this pawn now captures, I'm going to leave his pawns isolated, which is what happens. Now I bring my knight out, and I want to centralise my rooks and get my king to safety if possible. Okay, so now he puts his bishop in the corner. One rook comes to the middle where it's defending this pawn, should that pawn advance. Now brings another piece to look at that pawn, centralise my other rook. Indeed, the f pawn does push forwards, but I've got two defenders, two attackers. That's okay, it's not in his interest to capture yet. And now with this king move, I put his king in check. He could have blocked with the knight and then maybe castled later. I don't think he's moved his king so far. And now I decide to move my knight in. Obviously I'm targeting the f2 pawn and the fork. It's a standard threat. And I figure that, I'm actually talking to myself at this point. And by the way, we haven't used a minute yet of the time. The queens are off the board, two minor pieces are off the board. So we are technically in an ending, really, already. So the way I'm thinking about it is I've managed to get my king to relative safety behind my pawns here. White's king has moved, and it's still in the middle of the board. So what I want to do is bust open the board. Okay, I have centralised my rooks. I'm actually in the much stronger position in the game. So I decide to go gung-ho. If I can capture that knight, force the pawn to take, it only strengthens my position, and again I'm doing that. So this is a forcing move. I'm forcing white to have to respond. He captures with the knight, I recapture with the pawn, rook comes across, I defend, and yeah, we're still in the first 2 minutes of the game. We haven't used a minute each yet. And now the d pawn is pushed, and I decide because remember this king is still here and it's in line with my rook, it's opening up the board now will be in my favour. The only downside of that is that he has a bishop on the board, which is a long range piece. It can zip around. I've only got a knight, but we've still got all the rooks on the board, so well, we did do. Okay, rook takes, and I recapture with the king, because otherwise if I'd recaptured with the rook he could have taken this pawn for free. And now he grabs my knight. I didn't have time to do anything to protect that, so now we've got actually a very similar situation. I'm currently one pawn up, but we've both got doubled pawns. So I've got double pawns there, he's got double pawns there. We've got 3 and a 1. So very, very even kind of position. So now is when it comes down to, so at this point now, I thought for 30 seconds on my next move. I've got all that time on the clock, and the key thing now is to figure out, okay, what is going to make the difference in this endgame? How can I win this game? So the first thing I do is lift my rook up so that at least it's defending some of these pawns. The pawns could then maybe start to move and defend each other a little bit. White's pawns are fairly bad. I mean, he's got a reasonable kind of grouping here on the queen side, but so he pushes a pawn forward, and now I want to centralise my king. That's a key theme in the ending. A king is one of your absolute most powerful pieces, and you want to get it involved in the game where it can be the most useful. So I'm thinking about getting my king up here, maybe try and clear these 3 pawns away, because these 3 pawns cannot protect each other. Rook to c1. So this rook's starting to look a little bit constrained in there, which might give me some time. So I bring my rook up, and it's now time to start gobbling pawns, right? So it's a race for gobbling the pawns up. Rook comes up, and now I need to calculate, right? If I grab a pawn, he grabs a pawn, I grab a pawn, what's going to happen? Rook will probably come down here with check and a fork and grab this pawn, right? So you really need to, and this is a point where in the game where, because there's relatively little on the board, you can, as a beginner, pretty much figure out what you're going to do. So I do grab the pawn, I allow him to take that one, I take that one, he comes down exactly how I saw it happening. So he's going to take this, but then if I take the pawn on a2, that's protecting the pawn on a7, right? So I move my king out of check, he grabs, I grab, and now he can't capture a7. He'll probably capture c6 with check, he does, I move up, and now he moves down. So this pawn's protected, but I can't actually defend both of these with the king. If I move the king down, he can just move back up. And I don't want to end up in a draw, I don't want, you know, repetition, so I push one pawn, and he grabs the other. Okay, so now we are completely kind of symmetrical position again. White has 2 pawns and 1 on the edge, and likewise I have exactly the same situation, right? 2 pawns together and 1 there. But now you've got to look at the differences on the board. What are the key differences on the board? Well, the most important, I think, at this point is actually to do with our kings. Okay, my king has the run of the board. My king can go more or less wherever it wants. I mean, yeah, it's busy at the moment defending this pair of pawns. White's king, on the other hand, is tied to the back rank because of the position of my rook. Right, that's the important thing. This rook here is on the outside of my king. Okay, so my king can't go to like these squares because of the rook, right? But it means it has the entire rest of the board. Okay, this king only has a few squares to go to, right? That's a key difference. Okay, so let's move on. So pawn grabbing time again. This pawn is currently undefended. King moves to defend, and so what I've actually done here is I've let White's king out by doing that sequence of moves. But I come down here, so what this means is that this pawn now cannot advance because my rook can just grab it, protected by the king. So White comes along and grabs my a pawn, which I've undefended. So I think maybe those last couple of moves were not very accurate from me. However, it means that I can now snatch h3, and we're in exactly the same position again. King protecting 2 pawns, and a rook on the board. Now, key thing here, and this is what I wanted to bring to your attention, is to do with being aware of the promotion square. So I want you to just watch how the next kind of dozen moves roll out. So king moves down, so our most advanced pawns are on our 4th rank, each of us, so it's now a case of a foot race to the line. Who can get a queen first? But not all queens are created equal. Okay, so now I move my rook across. I could have just, I think, moved it to h4, but then I could have blocked it with my own pawn if my pawn advances. So I want to come here and I want to stop. I want to slow down the advance of this pawn as much as I can. Okay, so pawn goes forwards, check. King comes there, and now rook to e5, pinning the pawn in an absolute pin against the king. Right, my objective now is to get my most advanced pawn up to queen and prevent this pawn from doing the same thing. Again, look at the position of our rooks. White's rook is on the outside again because of grabbing that pawn. So it can't check my king. It can't really do anything, whereas my rook here is doing a good job. It's got this pawn in that pin. Okay, so white moves his other pawn, and now I start pushing. Okay, now see how this goes. So now the rook has to come across, and pawn pushes again. So I'm now only 2 jumps away from promotion, and this pawn is still pinned, and it's 3 jumps away from promotion. So, critical moment of the game now. White decides to play rook to f7. Now, at this point, I stop and I calculate for 15 seconds or so, and I decide that actually forcing the exchange of rooks is winning. And I think white should have thought a bit more carefully about that idea. But I think actually the game is probably lost at this point already. So this is what I figure out. Okay, well, in fact I'll just show you because it's okay. So yeah, first thing, I defend the pawn. Remember, this pawn was pinned up until the king moving away. Okay, now I move the rook across. So I'm offering an exchange of rooks, because if rook takes, king takes, and this is an important end game principle that you need to know. Okay, and it's just called the square. So if you have a square between your pawn that's trying to get to promotion, okay, equal sides, and so and going up to the edge, right? So if the pawn was here, the square would be much larger, right? And if your opponent's king can enter the square, it means that the king can capture your pawn either before or when it promotes. Okay, if the king can't get into the square, so if this is black's move now, right, then black would move to here, and that would be the square, and the king can't get into the square, and then the pawn promotes. Now, so if white takes the rook, which he does, okay, and I recapture, what white should be doing now is put the king into the square. Okay, so let's see if he does that. No, he doesn't do that, right? Instead, he tries to push his pawn for the line, and it looks like we are fairly equal at this point. However, one thing you have to be very, very conscious about is, I mean, sometimes you'll have a situation where both sides have got a pawn racing for promotion, and both of them promote on the same turn. But you have to be aware of having a queen on a particular square. What does that mean? Now, look at this. So let's even say it's white's move next, which it isn't, because I get to f2 now. But look, if white goes next, figure this out, right? Pawn to c7, right? Now it's black's move. Pawn to f2. And now, check this out. Pawn to c1 with a queen, right? But then on the very next go, black goes pawn to f1 with a queen. So sorry, c8, f1, okay? And look at this. If there's a queen on there, white's going to be in check. All right? And also, the king and the queen are on the same file right now. So let's say, you know, I have a queen on here, and there's a queen here, and the king moves like that, for example, then I could move my queen across, and that's a skewer. His king has to move, and I win the queen, right? So having the initiative at the point of promotion is very, very important. But as it is, white should have played the king in, didn't do that, so we go forward, and now he's one step away, but I queen, and I queen with check. And that is going to be overwhelming, because white now doesn't have time to promote this pawn. So we dance around a little bit, I come down, and he realizes that actually there's no way now to defend that pawn. He can't move to any of these squares. He can only go there, there, or there, and then on the next turn I'm going to get the pawn with check, and it will lead to an inevitable defeat. In addition, I have another pawn that can go up there. So, you know, resigned the game with 7 minutes still on the clock. Bit of a frantic game. I think both of us were a bit gung-ho at the beginning, but I trusted in the knowledge that I have about endgames to be able to secure the victory in this. So I thought that would be an interesting lesson just to work through with you. Hope it's been useful. See you later.